Hello one and all. Today what I've got in front of me is a box of the Plastic Soldier Company's late war British infantry. Now I'm looking at these guys today because somebody recently asked me about sort of getting started with wargaming on a budget, and 1/72 scale can be a pretty good way of doing that. These guys are sort of 20mm scale rather than the more common 28mm heroic scale. So something like, for example, Warlord Games, their bolt action rule set is normally aimed at 28mm figures, but you'll find that the 20mm range, so these 1/72 scale guys, actually work quite well with that same ground scale. Same too with Chain of Command. In fact, most skirmish level games will work pretty well with these 1/72 scale figures, and I'll call them 20mm from now on. Now this box has got 66 figures in it, and it comes on these frames as you'd expect. Now there's 3 of these in the box, and they are all identical, and on each of these there are parts enough to make a full 10-man section. I'll get a little bit closer there actually. Then another 5-man sort of Bren group, and there's officers and sort of little specialists on the frames there as well. You know, you've got a couple of extras there that you're probably not going to need for most gaming level stuff. But considering that once you've made up all of the riflemen and NCOs, you've got enough for a full, 4 10-man sections and then a 5-man section left over with officers and that, you know, that's a pretty decent sized platoon, and it'll certainly get you started for most things like bolt action. Now the detail on these is pretty good. I was actually quite impressed having a look at them. Everything's quite deep cut, and there's not a lot of flash. Particularly along with the backs of sleeves and stuff like that. Again, I was fairly impressed. It only took me a few seconds just with the knife to scrape most of that off. They come fairly clean, and that's quite impressive, especially at this scale. Details on them are good too, and one of the features that I quite like is if I find... Here we go, this fella here is a good example of... He's actually got the option you can assemble him with either a Sten or a rifle. So there are a couple of options there. Here's one with a rifle or a Bren gun. So you can make up, you know, smaller groups if you fancy, and that's quite nice. The poses on them are pretty cool too. One of them in particular that stands out is there's a guy who's actually crouching, and not like sort of kneeling, but he's probably, you know, squatting down. And when he's assembled, I've got one of him over here, you know, he's looking down his rifle and sighting a target before he goes for a shot. That's a pose I've not seen on these sort of figures before, so actually quite impressed overall. There's one big downside to this kit, and that is, like I said, fairly fussy. If you look up close, I'll see how close I can get in here. On the right hip of all of these guys is where their respirator bag is hanging. And then over instead on the left, if we can... can't see it on these guys, but on their left-hand side is where they've got their water bottles. Now the way this webbing was designed was that the water bottle was on the right hip and the respirator bag was slung across the left. Now not only that, but the webbing which is holding the water bottle to the wrong side is also wrong. Instead of being sort of the cross shape, it's this weird holster looking thing. It's such an odd detail, and I really can't see why they would have made that mistake, but it is there, so something to be aware of. But other than that, these things are pretty cool. In particular, I like that the rifles are probably a little bit chunkier than they should be at this scale, but that's good, I think, for gaming. They've sort of deliberately aimed in that direction. Now there's 10 men all made up. They don't come with any bases, unfortunately. I had to supply those, but that's really much of a much. Now, they do come, like I said, there's officers, there's medics, there's radio operators, and there's a couple of snipers. So you've got a fairly decent sort of selection of specialists that you can use to make a platoon in most of these skirmish level games. Now, considering as well that this whole box cost me £11.75. Now, in US dollars at the moment, that's about $17. So you've got, like I said, 45 infantry with the specialists to go with them, and you know, that's going to cost you less than $20. That's pretty impressive. Now, here's one I prepared earlier, just to sort of show you how they look once they're painted. And they're not too bad. They paint up pretty well. Like I said, that detail on them is fairly impressive for this scale, and with the right job, they look pretty nice. There's that rogue water bottle though. Ugh. Whoa, what's going on? One of the cool things too is that the Plastic Soldier Company also does a really large range of tanks, funnily enough. And I've got one of those perched here. This is the M4A1, and it's a pretty chunky little kit too. Like I said, these are designed with gaming in mind, I think, and here's what they look like when they're on the sprue. So nice and simple. You see, there's not a lot of options on these sprues, unfortunately. One thing that they've actually got on their smaller sprues is the option that you can have the 75mm or the 76mm with a whole other turret option. So for the larger sets to have just as advertised, I guess, is a bit of a shame, particularly as the actual hull itself is much the same kit. But that's much of a much. This cost me £8, so you're looking at about, what, $12? So if I plonk that down to my platoon, for probably about $30 after postage, you've got the better part of a bolt-action army. Now, the one downside with this British infantry that the Plastic Soldier Company does is that they don't do any heavy weapons options in this scale. They do in the 15mm scale, but things like Bren guns and your mortar teams, for example, unfortunately you'll need to find another producer for. Now, they do a pretty decent range of Germans in this scale, and they do their heavy weapons for them in 172 as well. So if you're looking at German options, then that's Plastic Soldier Company is probably a pretty good choice. But like I said, for price and the detailed range of poses, these guys I'd say are a pretty choice. If you're looking at getting started on a budget and you can convince someone else that 20mm is the way to go, Plastic Soldier Company will see you right. In particular, I quite like these guys just for the sort of character in them. And I think that as far as getting started in wargaming with these sort of simpler stuff, you've got other producers out there. Airfix, Revell, Italieri all do 172 scale figures. Some of them you can even buy in supermarkets. So keep your eyes peeled and you might find yourself a deal out there.